When we're working with our models, we can always go back in there and change them. We can change the fields it takes, we can add new fields, but we can also add methods. And we can add methods that hold certain business logic, which is considered to be a good practice to put your data-specific business logic into the models. But we can also add utility methods. And we can also override some built-in already existing methods. And a very trivial yet useful method, which we can override here, is the stir method with double underscores in front of it and after it. Now that's a method which exists on basically every class in Python. It's not Django specific and not model specific. But when you override it, you can define how instances of the class should, for example, be output in the console, in the terminal. For that, you need to return a string in there, and you can now format that string however you want. So here I'll use a f string, a formatted string. And there I then first of all want to output the book name. And then thereafter, maybe in parentheses, I want to output the rating. And therefore here we can simply point at self.title. That's how you add methods in Python classes. You get that self parameter automatically, and then you use it to refer back to the values in instance fields. And here I output self.rating. And with that, I'm saying, hey, whenever a book is output to the console, or in any other place where a string is needed, that's how it should be converted to a string. With that, if I quit that shell, and then restart it, and then again, import from book outlet models. So from there, we import book, and that should be models. And now, again, we can use book objects all, and now we have that more readable output. I didn't have to create the books and save them to the database first, because it's now a database which we're working with. It's persistent data. So when I save something there, that data in the database survives, even if I then close the terminal, stop my server, restart my computer. It doesn't matter. The data is still there. That's why here we don't have to save the data first, but instead we can directly query it again. Now here, I changed something in my class, but I didn't have to run migrations again because I just added a method. I didn't change the structure of a book. I didn't change the fields. But of course, we can do that as well. For example, here for the integer field. For our rating, we might want to set certain boundaries so that, for example, we can't add a rating higher than 5 or lower than 1. And for that, we can go back to the official docs, of course. And there, we learn that on the field options for those models, we can add validators. And then we can have a look at the validators documentation to learn about the built-in validators, which we can use to validate data before something is saved to the database. We can also build our own validators, as you see here. A validator in the end is just a function that takes a value and then either raises an error or not, if it accepts the value. But there also are built-in validators. And for example, there is a min and a max value validator, which is built in. And we can simply utilize that. For that, first of all, in the models file, from Django core validators, we import the min value and the max value validator classes. And then for the rating integer field, we simply set the validators field option and set this to a list of all the validators that should be executed and applied before something is saved in that field. And here we can then add the min value validator and instantiate that and pass the min value we want to enforce as an argument to this constructor, in this case 1. And then as a second item in that list, which we pass to validators, I can add a max value validator and set this to 5. And now I reformat this to make this a bit easier to read. And now we changed this field a little bit and we added our validators. We can also change more. We can, for example, add an author field and set this to models char field max length 100. So that here the author name should be entered and it shouldn't be longer than 100 characters. We can add another field and, for example, add the is best selling book and set this to models Boolean field, because it's a true or false value and we just want to know, is it best selling or not? And if we save all of that, we now updated our book class, but, and that's important, we didn't update the database yet. For the method which we added, there was nothing to update, but once we work on our schema and we edit our existing fields or add new fields, we of course want to tell Django that it should reach out to the database and also update that database, update the table in there, add the new columns. So to do that, what we need to do is quit this interactive shell down there with Ctrl-D, and then simply run python 3 manage py, make migrations again. Hit enter, and now here I actually get a prompt where I have to pick a choice. Because I'm trying to add a non-nullable field author to book without a default. So in the end, the problem which I have here is that of course we already have some data in our database and we have an existing books table, which up to this point, before we run these migrations, only has a title and a rating. Now I'm about to add 2 new fields, but I already have records, I already have rows in my table for the 2 books we added earlier. So now Django is basically asking me, what do you want to do for those new columns which you're adding? Because by default they're not allowed to be empty, that's what non-nullable means, but I don't know what to do. So what should I do? So we have to select a fix. We can either provide a one-off default now, which basically means that for the existing books we have in the table, some default value, which we specify now, will be set. Or we stop creating those migrations and we go back to our book model class and we tweak the settings for those fields to set up default values there, for example, or to allow those fields to be null. And I'll do the second. So I'll pick option 2 by entering 2, and that quits the migration process. So now I go back to my model here, to my class, and I now want to tweak these 2 new fields. And we now can either set up a default value by adding the default keyword argument, or we set null to true, which basically means that for this column, an entry in this database can have a null value and will receive a null value if no other value was provided. Null is a special SQL database value type, you could say, and instead of leaving that table blank then, which would simply not be allowed here per our setup, it would get a value which is null. So not empty, but null, which is a special value type representing nothing. Now setting null equals to true on char fields is not optimal, or at least you might want to reconsider it, because you then have this null type representing no value, and you possibly could also have an empty string, which probably means the same, but we're still going to do it here. An alternative would be to add blank equals true here to allow this field to be empty. So then null equals true wouldn't be required, because if this column does allow blank values, which it would do with blank equal true, everything would be fine. But here I'll go for null equals true instead to insert this null special value if no other value is provided. We're going to see blank in action later in the course as well. And I'll set null to true for the author, but for is best selling, I'll not do that. We could set null to false, but that's the default. Instead here, I will now simply add a default value here, which is false. So that by default, a book is not best selling, let's say. With that, with those changes made, we can now run make migrations again. And now you see it succeeded and it created a new migration file, which now contains the operations Django should execute to update our database. And you see that, for example, here it now simply adds fields for author and is best-selling, and that it manipulates, it alters the rating field to add those new validators which we added. That's what it's about to do. It also has a dependency on the previous migration, and that's only important because you could also roll back migrations, and therefore Django always needs to know in which order they were executed and so on. So with that, we can now run this migration by executing python 3 manage py migrate. And now it reaches out to the database and updates our database data. So let's now have a quick look at that updated data. For that, I'll again enter this interactive shell. And then in there, we import our book class. So from book outlet.models, I import book. And now we can run book objects all to get all the books. And then maybe use index 1 to get the second book, Lord of the Rings. And there, actually, we can now use the dot notation to access the author. That's one of the fields we have now. And that's something we haven't seen before, but you can access all those fields simply with the dot notation on the queried data when you have a single item. That's why I'm selecting a single item with that index here. So here I can access author, but this is empty because I allowed this to be empty, and for the existing records, we didn't add an author. But I can also access is best-selling, for example, and that would be false, because that was our default value here, which we set here. And of course, I can also access the rating instead if I want to, and I would see the rating which I assigned to that book. So that's what I can do here, and that's how we can update our models and then also run new migrations. With that, let's see how we can now also update data in the database. So not update the database and the tables, but the concrete data stored in there.